right, we're going to get started because it is just about 1 o'clock here on the East Coast. So welcome, everyone. My name is Jenna. I am the Director of Learning and Engagement at the National Constitution Center, and I'm really happy to have you here for our Women's History Month tour. And I want to caveat this with two things. One, we celebrate women's history all year round at the Constitution Center. And two, the 19th Amendment is just one piece of the story of women's history in America and in the world. But it's a really compelling story. And so we're really excited to kind of dive into it today and give you a tour of our fantastic exhibit at the Constitution Center, which is the 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Vote. And I am thrilled because you are in for a treat today because we have two of the women who were behind the exhibit here with us today. So Sarah Winsky is in the exhibit. She's our Director of Exhibits. And then Elena Popchak is our Manager of Exhibit Content. And they are going to give you your tour today. You are, because this is definitely a treat because nobody knows this exhibit backwards and forwards. As you can see, we are live from the center, so you might see some people saying hi in the background.
Very live from the center.
So with that, I am going to hand it over to Sarah, who is up there live, and but I will be in the chat, so if you have any questions, and I'll be sharing some resources as well. So definitely say hi and ask me questions as you go. All right, take it away, Sarah.
Hello. Hi, everyone. As you can see, we have lots of children in the building and they love being on camera. So I will try and corral the troops as much as I can. But as Jenna said, I am Sarah Winsky. I am the Director of Exhibits here at the National Constitution Center. And we're so excited to show you our newest exhibit. It's been up for a little while, but it's still our newest that we have, 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Vote. I am going to be in the gallery kind of moving us through this space, but I am mostly going to be handing it over to Elena Popchak, who's our Manager of Exhibit Content, and she is the person who wrote and curated this wonderful exhibit you're about to see. So she has all the best stories that she's going to be sharing with you. But if you have any questions during the tour, please feel free to put them in the chat. As Jenna said, she'll throw them to us. And if it's about the content or about exhibits or how we made this exhibit, we are happy to answer questions. So I'm going to step out of the way and try and make sure children aren't running through the shot and hand it over to Elena.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all of you out there who are joining us from across the country. Really appreciate it. We're delighted to share this exhibit with you. It's near and dear to our hearts. We worked on this exhibit for over a year to develop it. And it opened in 2020. And as Jenna mentioned, we do celebrate women's history all the time. So if you are in near the building at any point, definitely come check it out in person. But my hope today is to pull back the curtain a little bit and give you bit of a behind the scenes tour at how we create exhibits. And you can get a better sense of the women's suffrage movement, which was a nearly 70-year movement before women secured the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. And that was over 100 years ago. So this exhibit is divided into 3 sections. What you are seeing here is the first section of the exhibit, titled Fighting for Rights. And each of the sections are divided into different chunks of time. So we are capturing that 70-year movement. So it really begins in 1848. You can see there on the right of your screen. That's where we pick up because that was the first formal women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. Now, there was plenty of organizing that was happening before then for women's rights, but that's where we chose to pick up. The exhibit will end in 1920 officially, because of course that's when we get to the 19th Amendment, but the story continues on. History is a constantly moving process. So 1920 doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is able to vote. So there's important content that comes after 1920, important organizing in order to secure voting rights for all women. So we'll get into that a little bit towards the end, but we're going to turn back time here to that 1848 moment. And just think for a second about some of the terms I'm going to be mentioning as we go through this exhibit. So suffrage is a term I'll use a lot. You hear women's suffrage movement. It means voting rights. And you'll also hear me use the term suffragist. You may be familiar with suffragette. That's actually more of the British term. So in America, we use suffragists, and those are women who are fighting for their voting rights. Now, as we pick up in 1848, I mentioned it's important because it's the first formal women's rights convention. You can see an image from that convention here on this mural. But at that moment, who could vote at that time? Well, you turn back the clock, it is really mostly free adult white men. And there are some interesting stories from that moment. I saw, at least we have some people from New Jersey, but early in 1776, New Jersey state constitution actually did allow women to vote, surprisingly. But within a couple decades, they actually reverted to what other states were doing and only allowed free white male citizens to vote. So just fun fact there about New Jersey if you're from that area. Okay, but as we get here into the origins of the movement, so it really starts with the abolitionist movement. Women are incredibly involved fighting for the end of slavery, and it really grows, their own movement grows from that. So they're looking at not just voting rights at the beginning, they're really way more focused on all of these rights that women don't have. They can't inherit property. They can't have access to certain occupations. They can't make contracts. So they're really concerned about those rights, and eventually get to the point in 1848 where they meet in Seneca Falls formally for the first time. That meeting is organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You can see an image there in the center of your screen. That's Elizabeth Cady Stanton around the time of 1848 with her two children at the time. So she teams up with Lucretia Mott, who we can claim as a Philly native. She was a Quaker from the Philadelphia area. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized this first convention, and they are focused on all of those rights that I mentioned, trying to access education, have access to occupations, all of those things. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton decides to make this document known as the Declaration of Sentiments. This might be something you've heard of before, but she models her document off of the Declaration of Independence. But she's pushing for not just that all men are created equal, but all men and women are created equal. An important change there that she makes to the original declaration. But in her Declaration of Sentiments, she pushes for lots of rights, but importantly, includes the right to vote for women. Now, this was contentious at the time. It was debated at the convention, but ultimately enough people signed on to that voting rights resolution. So this is why it really kicks off the women's suffrage movement. Now, I'm going to ask if Sarah can zoom in because we very excitedly have a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments at the top of the case. And as you can probably tell, it's a very small and fragile document. There are only 12 other copies known to exist. So we are honored to be able to display one of those copies in our exhibit. The original has been lost to history. So the original signed version from the convention no longer exists. I'm hopeful it still lives on out there. Maybe it's in someone's attic. So if you ever find it in your house or in an antique store, definitely let us know. So we will start to move on to the next section here. As we continue from the 1840s into the 1850s, women continue to meet annually. They organize local conventions and are still pushing for various rights, including the right to vote. But as we reach an important date, 1861, some of you might be familiar with a very significant war that broke out at that time. It is indeed the Civil War. That moment is very significant for the movement because women pause their campaign in order to support the war effort. And they really want to focus on ending slavery. So as we continue through the Civil War, not much activity from the women's suffrage movement, but they are pushing for the 13th Amendment. So here in this first part of the screen that you're seeing, we get to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And then that leads to an important moment where people are coming together from the abolitionist movement, from the women's rights movement, and pushing for universal suffrage, meaning that everyone can vote, including newly freed Black men from the 13th Amendment, and also all women. Now, unfortunately, there is a moment here where we get to the 14th Amendment, and there is a split in the movement. So the 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship to all Americans, and this was the first time that gender was introduced into the Constitution, and this made the suffragists very angry. And as we get to some fracturing in the movement then about whose rights we are prioritizing, we have some white women who are starting to branch away from the larger universal suffrage movement just to fight for their own voting rights. Because when we get to the 15th Amendment, that is when Black men are guaranteed the right to vote. And this upsets many of those white suffragists who have been pushing for voting rights for everybody. They feel that they have been excluded. And some people argued that it wasn't the right time to push for women's voting rights, that they should prioritize the people who just got out of slavery, that they would need to secure equal rights for them. So as we move on in the exhibit, then this is through all the Civil War and Reconstruction era that you're seeing on the right side of your screen. We're going to focus in on the women and men who were fighting for women's suffrage. So we have this Meet the Suffragists wall in the 19th Amendment exhibit to show not only the diversity in the movement, but also that there are generations of women who are fighting for these rights. So we have some of the people featured here. We actually have some of their children in their photographs. So Lucy Stone is one of the women towards the left side of the screen. She is holding her daughter Alice, and Alice actually becomes a suffragist when she grows up. So that's a fun fact. Next to her is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These are spinning features. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is flipped around right now, but her daughter I will talk about later, Harriet Stanton Blatch. She is in that photo, I promise. It's very washed out, but she's a baby in that photo. And she later becomes a suffragist because let's not forget, this is a 70+ year movement. So you have ultimately 3 generations of women fighting for the right to vote. So this is only the beginning. We're still in the first section here. So let's not forget, as we start to think through this split in the movement after the 15th Amendment guaranteed Black men the right to vote, this is really that moment when a lot of the racist comments start to come out. You have a group splintering off to fight just for white women's rights. And then you have another branch of the movement that's still fighting for rights for all. So you start to bring that in, that colors the rest of the movement. And there's a lot of racism that is pervasive throughout the rest of this story. So certainly keep that in mind. And Black women were largely excluded from the white mainstream suffrage movement. Now, as we think through all these women who are involved in this movement, what are they doing to fight for their rights? So we're going to pivot now to the next part of the movement, where we're starting to get into women trying new tactics to push for their voting rights. So they've acknowledged, hey, we're no longer pushing for universal suffrage. We are pushing exclusively for women's voting rights because men right now should be able to vote under the Constitution. So we start to get to some really interesting tactics towards the late 1860s and into the 1870s. So this is all right after the Civil War. And what we feature here ballot boxes that show one of those tactics. So after we get to the 14th Amendment, it's saying that all Americans are citizens. And some women start to argue, well, doesn't that mean we should have the right to vote? Citizens have the right to vote. So they actually try to just go out and vote and see what happens. So this starts in 1868. It's known as the New Departure Movement. Going to have another New Jersey call out here. This was the first time 1868 women in Vineland, New Jersey actually just set up their own voting tables on election day and cast mock ballots. There were 200 women in total who did this, and this really initiated this New Departure movement where they're just attempting to vote. So we feature a couple of the stories here. Some of my favorites are, you see North Carolina at the bottom of your screen. What happens there is actually in Johnston County, North Carolina, 200 Black women tried to vote. This is in 1871. And fun fact, they successfully registered and voted in the local election. But here's the caveat. They were dressed in men's clothing. So I think that was probably the only reason why they got in. But some really cool stories that came to light when we were working on this project. One of the most famous is Susan B. Anthony in New York. That's on the right side of your screen. In 1872, she successfully registered to vote along with her three sisters. She voted in the presidential election for Ulysses S. Grant, but she was ultimately arrested and tried for illegal voting. Now, a lot of these stories were documented at the time in the History of Women's Suffrage. So that was a publication that came out as they were actively working on voting, getting women's voting rights. They were recording all of these great stories. But unfortunately, this tactic didn't last for very long. By 1875, the Supreme Court heard a case known as Minor v. Happersett. And that ultimately was decided that no, women do not have the right to vote under the 14th Amendment, even though they are considered citizens. But there are women at this time who can vote, and that is going to bring us to, as we pivot to the left here, a really amazing artifact that I'm very excited to feature. This is an original ballot box from the 1870s. And interestingly, on it is stamped that it is for women's ballots. So you can see it there starting to come in. It looks like a stencil. It says women's ballots, and it's from the town of Elwood. The company is marked at the top there. It's George Bernard of St. Louis, Missouri. So that's the company that created the ballot box. But these ballot boxes actually indicate that some women could start to vote. And this comes from state campaigns that were happening beginning in the 1860s, where women were pushing for the right to vote at the state level. So they didn't get that constitutional amendment that said everyone in the country could vote, but they started to push for state level change. So we know there's a couple territories and states at this time that are granting women the right to vote. But you may be wondering why there's a separate ballot box for women to vote. We go to vote today and we all vote in the same box. Now, this was done because women couldn't vote in all elections. So in some territories and states, they could only vote in local elections or maybe elections that dealt with tax matters or school board elections. So they had to keep separate ballot boxes for women to make sure that they weren't voting in the other elections that they couldn't vote in. So that's why we get this type of ballot box. And I will point out one more thing. You may notice a little metal piece at the bottom of this ballot box that projects out. It occurs on both sides of the ballot box, the front and the back, and that is known as a mule mount ballot box. And it was meant to be stabilized on the back of a mule because this is a round drum. In order for it to not roll off the mule, it stabilized it, and hence why it is called a mule mount. All right, now we're going to start moving on to the next section of the exhibit, where we really dig into these state campaigns for women's suffrage. And through this whole time, women are petitioning Congress. They're still trying to get the right to vote at the national level, but they really start to realize if we're going to have success, we probably need to get a lot of change at the state level, because sometimes what can happen is if you push for enough change at the state level, people start to realize, hey, this isn't so bad. Why don't we make it a national change? That was their hope. And there were a lot of people that feared women's suffrage. They feared that women would suddenly abandon all of their responsibilities at home, and all of the nurseries would be abandoned, and there would be no food on the kitchen table. So there were a lot of fears that people had around women getting the right to vote, even though it's not like you're voting every single day and avoiding all of these responsibilities.
Kind of
yes.
connected to that fear, we do have a question in the chat.
Sure.
If that sort of separate ballot box, do we know that those ballots weren't collected then thrown away? Is there any evidence that like those were actually counted?
I would hope so. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I don't think we have any evidence of one way or the other, but I think we can assume that they were counted.
Yes, I would certainly hope so, especially because that is an instance where that town allowed women to vote. And I have not been able to track where the town of Elwood actually is. There's a couple Elwoods out there that as territories or states that allowed women to vote in the 1870s. So there's just a lot of uncertainty about exactly where it came from. But I think because it was a ballot box they provided, they certainly should have counted the votes.
I mean, it would have been so easy just to say, oh, no, women can't vote. So why go through the trouble of collecting the ballots and then not counting them?
Yes.
So, thank you for your question, Lisa. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Lena.
No, thank you. Yeah, that was a great question. Okay, so as we enter this new section, you might start to notice it looks a little similar to the last section. This covers the period from 1878. So that is the official end of the Reconstruction era, which was the end of the Civil War, and goes until 1916. So that's right before we entered the war in Europe, which we know as World War I. So it's really this moment where the state campaigns become incredibly important. But we should have another check-in in 1878, who can actually vote? Well, we know we have the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870, and that banned racial discrimination in voting. But I should note that there was a lot of racial violence and intimidation that prevented Black men from voting, not only in the South, but also in the North. So important to note that there are amendments, and then there is the on-the-ground reality of who could actually vote in practice. And then there were some women, as I mentioned, by 1878, it was Wyoming and Utah. They are both territories at the time. They allowed women to vote in all elections. Okay, now where we've ended up here is our state-by-state artifact case. So we feature some really cool artifacts that pertain to those state-level campaigns to extend suffrage for women. And what you really start to notice is that change happens first in the West. And that might be a little surprising, but it was mostly territories that wanted to attract women to their territory in order to have enough people in order to ask Congress that they wanted to become a state. So there was a very practical reason behind it. But we see that there is change from west to east is how women's suffrage goes across the country. But what you're seeing here is a really cool image from Pennsylvania. So anyone who's tuning in from Pennsylvania or from Philly, we have this great picture of a little girl standing next to the Justice Bell. Now, it may look very familiar because it was modeled after the Liberty Bell. So it's an exact replica of the Liberty Bell. But this was in an effort to get Pennsylvania women the right to vote. So this was made in 1915, and it was a replica bell that traveled across the state. It traveled in total 5,000 miles to raise support for a ballot measure that would have granted Pennsylvania women the right to vote. And I regret to inform you that even though there's this really cool bell, and they put all of this effort into getting Pennsylvania women the right to vote, the ballot measure ultimately failed. And this may surprise you, but Pennsylvania women never got the right to vote before the 19th Amendment. So while there were quite a lot of states that allowed women to vote, at least in some elections, Pennsylvania was not one of them. And at the bottom of the artifact case, there is an artifact tied to this justice bell. It's a little watch fob, so much smaller than the actual bell, but still pretty cool that that exists. So the justice bell does still exist. It's in Valley Forge at Washington Chapel, and it did travel back to Philadelphia for the anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020, and they rang the bell. And what's significant about that is this bell was silenced until women got the right to vote. So it never rang until 1920, when women were granted the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So, little fun story there. But as we zoom out here and think about that map that I was describing where the change went from west to east, I wanted to note that we created a really cool digital interactive that maps out everything that was happening at the state level. And this is available online. So while we have it here, what Sarah's showing this in the exhibit, you can do this interactive online. Jenna is going to share it, but it basically captures every state. So no matter where you're tuning in from, you can see what your state story is. But it's inspired by this wonderful image called The Awakening. That's the mural you're seeing on your screen, where this woman is pushing across from the west, where there's women who were granted the right to vote at the state level, and all the women in the east are reaching out for her, and she's bringing votes for women from the west to the east. So you can really see that change mapped out in the interactive, and you can actually move a timeline and see over time how more and more states were added to the map. And then ultimately, it's on the eve of the 19th Amendment, you can see there were quite a lot of states that did allow women to vote, even if it was just in some elections. But very significant part of the movement that gets us ultimately to the 19th Amendment. All right, and you got a glimpse at the start here of a very important artifact display in this exhibit, tied to all of the amazing memorabilia, marketing materials, advertising materials that were created in support of women's suffrage. So really fun artifacts that were created for the cause. There was an important moment where there were a lot of collectibles that were starting to be created in the 1890s. And this was alongside the growth of the women's suffrage movement. So they jumped on this bandwagon to create really cool collectibles to get out the word that they want votes for women. So that's why you see a lot of really cool items that are branded with votes for women, or really fun sayings like the one banner that's shown here on screen, "Mother is the best ever, but not good enough to vote." So just really fun items that we pulled together to feature in this exhibit. But you see a range of household materials on display here, because they wanted to get their message into the home. So you see things like calendars and fly swatters, cookbooks, pepper shakers, pencils, really anything you can imagine. They branded and then people would get the message into their house, and that was a really fun talking point if you had someone over and you could show support for the cause. Other things you see a lot of are postcards. This was actually a time frame, 1902 to 1915, where postcards were very, very collectible, and it was actually known as the golden age of the postcards. So you'll see multiple ones on display here in the one case you're seeing on your screen. There's also fun Valentines as well. Those are in the bottom right there. So just really spreading the message far and wide. Great that you're seeing this here. There's a calendar on the upper right of that case, and various other items that really got the word out. Buttons are another that are especially popular. And if Sarah slides to the right, you can see a nice display of buttons, but they were incredibly cheap to produce and easy to give away for free, or large boxes of them. So there's a lot of buttons that exist out there. So we have a nice display here of buttons. You also see dishware, so votes for women. Teacups and saucers were really popular for luncheon parties. So these were all incredibly popular and important for getting the word out. And you may notice a couple themes if we go for a wider shot here. You may notice a lot of colors that are getting repeated, or symbols that you're seeing a few on various items. So the color yellow or gold, that's very significant to the suffrage movement. And you can see that even just here, I see at least 5 items that have yellow or gold. And the reason for that is that Kansas was the very first territory to vote on women's suffrage. Although it failed, this was in 1868, was 100 years off there. In 1868, they voted for women's suffrage, and Kansas's state flower is the sunflower. So if you ever see sunflowers tied to the movement, that is why. And the color yellow comes from that as well. And lastly, on this area, you'll see the anti-suffragists. We have a little feature, much smaller case here. Those items are a lot rarer, but it is important to note that the anti-suffragists were a strong force. They fought against women's voting rights, and it was a lot of women too fighting against their own voting rights. It doesn't seem to make much sense, but they had a lot of arguments against the movement. You see items that they produced for their cause are usually red. So some of the buttons you're seeing on your screen are red. So those are really that anti-view. So they're saying vote no on women's suffrage. But they are, for a variety of reasons, saying they don't want voting rights. A lot of people are motivated by race, and they're not wanting everyone to be able to vote. Others are really hoping for a states' rights approach, that states should determine who should be able to vote, not the national government. So that's an important reason that they're arguing against it. But there's just, in general, a lot of resistance to non-educated, non-white populations getting the right to vote. And if Sarah zooms out, you can see we get into some of that content on the anti-suffragist panel at the bottom of the screen. But later I'm going to talk about an interactive that you can explore online that gets into the debates and why people were wanting or not wanting women to get the right to vote. Okay, we have officially entered the 19-teens, and up to this point, the state campaigns are playing a really important role in the movement, but we get to an important moment around 1912. So we see the first women's suffrage parade, and I'm guessing a lot of people are at least somewhat familiar with women's suffrage parades. They got a lot of great photographs from that time. There's video that exists. This is really where I think a lot of us think the traditional women's suffrage movement really starts. But there's so much groundwork in the decades leading up to this moment, but a lot of great imagery associated with it. And what happens in 1912 is Harriet Stanton Blatch. So she is the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I promised she would come back. She is now grown up and she spends some time in Great Britain and sees that they are using way different tactics in the British suffrage movement. And she brings over some of those tactics and wants to get more media attention and decides to organize a parade in New York that drew 20,000 marchers. And ultimately, she has someone else that did a similar thing as Alice Paul. So again, a New Jersey call out. Alice Paul is a suffragist from New Jersey. She was also a Quaker. She spent time in Great Britain as well, and she was actually arrested during their movement and jailed there. But she was very excited by the more aggressive tactics that the British were using to fight for women's suffrage. So when she came back, she also wanted to see more aggressive confrontational tactics because she just felt that the movement was a little tired. There was some progress on the state campaigns, but then early 1900s, not much progress was happening, and there was no movement in Congress to really pass a suffrage amendment. So what we feature here is a march in Washington, D.C. in March 1913. It's the day before President Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated. That was very purposeful. They knew they would get a lot of media attention, but they had women from around the world come to Washington, D.C. An estimated 5,000 women marched from the Capitol to Pennsylvania Avenue. So this is a panoramic image of the marchers, and they were indeed led by a woman on a horse. So you can actually see her on the left of your screen and then on the right of your screen as well. Her name was Inez Milholland. So you'll also see we recreated a car because this is also a time when cars are coming into the mix. We created a bit of a parade float here, but they would create a lot of things like this for these parades to make a big deal and garnish a lot of attention from the media. And it worked. So by the time we get to 1913, these really start to become more prominent. But as I alluded to earlier, there is a lot of racism in the movement that is preventing Black women from participating. And one of the things that they decided to do is for this particular parade in Washington, D.C., they told Black women to march in the back of the parade. They were fearful that Southern white women would lose support for the cause if they also believed that Black women would get the right to vote. So Ida B. Wells, we do feature an image of her in the exhibit. She decided to break ranks, did not listen to that, and marched with her Chicago delegation. So really fun that she ultimately decided to not listen to that. And as we get to the final section here, you may get a sense we are getting closer to 1920. So I promise we're nearing the 19th Amendment. But this final section, winning the vote, starts in 1917. So that is officially when the United States enters the war in Europe, we know of as World War I. This is also where I think you're going to start to remember a lot of the great images from the suffrage movement the final few years. But let's remember that woman, Alice Paul, who had a big mark on the final few years of the movement. She is still pushing for more aggressive tactics. So what do the women start to do? Well, they start picketing the White House. This was the first time that people actually picketed the White House. So we think of that as something that people do all the time now, but the suffragists were actually the first, and they were organized by the National Woman's Party, which was led by Alice Paul. And they were mostly focused on convincing President Wilson to come out in support of the amendment, because they're realizing at this point, we can only get so many states to grant women the right to vote. We really need a constitutional amendment. And we need to go to the heart of the federal government and convince President Wilson to announce his support for the amendment, and then Congress may finally pass it. So they are placing pressure on President Wilson. They're holding watch fire demonstrations. You see at the bottom of your screen between the two women is a little fire. They actually burned some of Wilson's speeches and kept the flames running as they picketed throughout Washington, D.C. Now, what happened in April 1917 when we enter the war in Europe? The women start to get arrested. So President Wilson eventually has them arrested for obstructing traffic, which was a bit of a joke for what they were actually doing. But they're arrested and they end up in jail. This is another pivotal moment in the women's suffrage movement. So Sarah could zoom to the right side of the exhibit. We start to see what happens when women end up in jail. So we do feature a jail cell in the exhibit where there is a bit of a theater piece that we created that captures one woman's experience when she was in jail. But basically what happens is Alice Paul knew this was going to happen. It happened in Great Britain when she was there, and knew that it would garner a lot of media attention. Women were very poorly treated in jail as political prisoners, and some would spend up to 6 months in jail. Alice Paul herself was in jail multiple times. Some of the women staged hunger strikes to protest that they were getting imprisoned, and some were force-fed with feeding tubes. What we see here is a little artifact case, and I want to call out the letter in the top left of the case that is actually written and signed by Alice Paul, which is very exciting. It's on National Woman's Party letterhead, and she is asking women to come out and picket. This is from October 1917. You can sort of see her signature at the bottom there. But at the bottom of the letter, she says, "All who picket must be prepared for imprisonment. The longest sentence that can be imposed is 6 months, hoping that we may have your help. Very sincerely yours, Alice Paul." They did get a lot of women out to support this, and a lot of women were jailed. People were very sympathetic to the women that experienced such horrendous conditions in jail. So it was a turning point for the movement. But this was brought on by World War I. So we have an important section of the exhibit where we get into the impact of World War I. As I mentioned, April 1917, that's when we enter the war in Europe. And in that moment, you have women, like they did for the Civil War, they paused their suffrage campaign and really focused on the war effort. So you have women volunteering in Red Cross headquarters, have women supporting manufacturing of weapons in factories. So a lot of support, but then you have women who are still fighting for the right to vote. And they believe this is even more important that they get the right to vote because we're fighting for democracy abroad, and yet we don't even allow women to vote back here at home. So it's an important twofold campaign there where some are proving that they are very patriotic and should have the right to vote, and others who are pushing for a truer democracy in the United States. So this ultimately convinces Woodrow Wilson to come out in support of the amendment, and that is a major turning point that finally gets Congress to pass the amendment. So as we reach the final area of the exhibit, we do now have the 19th Amendment getting passed by Congress in June 1919, and then it gets sent to the states for ratification. Now, we've come a long way on this journey today. We've gone over about 70 years, and you may want to dig a little bit more into how exactly we got here and what debates were happening that ultimately convinced people that maybe women should get the right to vote. So the interactive that you see here on your screen will be shared in the chat. It's called The Debates. You can hear, we recorded actors and actresses saying different quotes from the time and saying things for and against women's suffrage. And I have to admit, some of them are very funny, very distressing, what people were saying for and against women's suffrage. So definitely recommend checking that out and understanding what people were saying at the time. All right, but we're finally here. We've reached it. We have gotten to the 19th Amendment getting passed by Congress, and now it's with the states, and it needs to be ratified. So by the time, there's plenty of states at the beginning that are very excited about ratifying the amendment, but then in March 1920, no new states are ratifying. So it has the potential to not be a part of the Constitution. Delaware rejected the amendment in June, and then the next state to hold a vote was Tennessee. They really didn't think it was going to pass. The legislature there was split dead even. But there is a man named Harry T. Byrne. His picture is at the bottom of your screen. He's a legislator in Tennessee. He was the youngest legislator. I believe he was only 24 years old. He received a letter from his mother the day that he was going to go vote on the 19th Amendment. She told him that he should be a good boy and vote for women's suffrage. And ultimately, he switched his vote at the last minute, and the 19th Amendment got ratified by Tennessee with one vote. That's also the letter there on your screen that says "Mother knows best." So this affected everything, and that was enough states to be ratified and become a part of the U.S. Constitution. So that's all thanks to Harry T. Byrne's mother, Feb Byrne. What you're also seeing on your screen is the 19th Amendment. So very exciting. This is officially on display. This is an original ratification copy coming from Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, oddly enough, was one of the first states to ratify the amendment in June 1919. They were the 7th state to ratify, and go figure, although they never gave women the right to vote, they somehow were one of the first to ratify. So very cool if you get to see this in person. It is on display for the next couple months. All right, we've made it. We've gotten to the 19th Amendment. I have one more point to make before I turn it over for some questions. I think we got some great questions in the chat. Let's take a moment to look at the actual text of the amendment. What does it say? Now we feature it on a wall here. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It's rather small. But what importantly it focuses on is discrimination on account of sex. There are plenty of other ways that states discriminated against people and prevented them from voting. So this is what I mentioned at the beginning of the tour. Is 1920 comes around, we get to the 19th Amendment. There's millions of women who are able to vote under it, but because there are other ways that can discriminate against voters, states start adding literacy tests and other discriminatory measures to prevent people from voting. So there was a longer movement beyond 1920 that continued in order to secure that all women could equally vote and have equal access to the ballot box and not have discriminatory practices like literacy tests be allowed. So that is an ongoing movement in the long civil rights movement that eventually leads to the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, ensuring that everyone has access to the ballot box. So that brings me to my conclusion of the exhibit. So I would love to answer all of your questions.
Yeah, Elena, and I'm gonna group a couple because they came in and I think some of them are on similar themes. So we have Serenity asking how long it took to create this exhibit. So I think that's for you and Sarah. And then Valerie was also interested in where our artifacts come from, specifically, are any of them from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, but kind of where these great documents that and artifacts we have on display are all coming from.
Yes, absolutely. So we created this exhibit in about a year. It was slightly delayed due to the pandemic. So we were originally planning on opening in June 2020, and we opened in August 2020. So we had a little bit more than a year, but we created this all in-house. So everything that you're seeing was written and designed by all of our great team members. So if we had more time, that would have been great, but we managed. And all of the artifacts, thank you for asking that. Many of the Votes for Women artifacts are coming from the collection of Ronnie Lipinski Sachs. While we were working on this project, she actually passed away from complications with cancer, but she was so excited to work with us on this project. She even invited us to her house to see her great collection. She really wanted to continue that. So we've worked with her daughter ever since. So we could not have achieved this exhibit with this many great artifacts without her. But we feature other collections. The copy of the amendment is from the Pennsylvania State Archives. So each state usually has their ratification copy of the amendment. So right now we're featuring Pennsylvania's. Specifically, someone asking about Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Not currently, but we did when we opened, we had a letter from a Philadelphia suffragist where I showed you the Alice Paul letter. That's where we had a letter that pertained to her going to prison for picketing.
Also, some really interesting questions about the symbolism and kind of the reasoning behind them. So Bert asked why a bell and not something else, why the Liberty Bell? And then Shirley wants to know about the color white and why all these suffragists were wearing that color white.
Definitely. So the bell. There's a lot that you see in the suffrage movement that harkens back to the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. So the bell is really purposeful in symbolizing that their fight is equal to us declaring independence from Great Britain. So that was in an effort to give more like, this is a very patriotic act that we're doing this, you supported the revolution, you should support this. So very purposeful in the type of imagery you're seeing from the American Revolution. And then as far as the color white, so it's interesting when I was researching about the colors, because you usually see the gold, white, and purple, and everything that I was finding, for the most part, except for the sunflower, the Kansas sunflower with gold, all the others, they just became that way. And then afterwards, they tried to add symbolism to it. So I came across a quote that I can share here from 1913 in the Suffragist magazine. That was by the National Woman's Party with Alice Paul. So this is kind of after the fact, they're justifying why they chose these colors. But purple is the color of loyalty, constancy to purpose, unswerving steadfastness to a cause. White, the emblem of purity, symbolizes the quality of our purpose. And gold, the color of light and life, is that as the torch that guides our purpose, pure and unswerving. So that's the closest I got to white as purity, purity of the cause. Makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. But some practical questions. People are asking, is this tour being recorded? It is being recorded. We'll probably post it on our YouTube channel in the next day or so you can check it out there. And then there was a lot of kind of discussion in the chat about women being arrested and kind of making that decision. Why would they want to be arrested for this cause? So can you speak to any more about the kind of motivation behind that kind of decision? I know you spoke about it a little bit, but there definitely was some interest.
Yeah, it seems like a hard decision to make, going into it knowing this could happen to you. You could be in jail for a significant period of time. all of the primary sources that I looked at working on this exhibit, it really seems that there was an understanding of that this could really be it. This could push enough people to support the cause and have people be just appalled at what they're seeing of the conditions in the jail cells and how these political prisoners were being treated. So there was just this higher cause that they felt this would really be important. And one of the women that we featured was Dora Kelly Lewis. That's the Philadelphia suffragist who the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has some of her letters. The letter that we featured was her writing from jail. And she, I believe, was in her 60s, her late 60s, by the time she was picketing and fully knowing that she was going to be arrested and end up in jail. Yet she still made that decision. She also was force-fed and at one point beaten in an occurrence known as the Night of Terror in 1917. And she made it out and she willingly went to do that. So put yourself in her shoes and imagine what that decision was like, particularly at that age. But she had probably been spending the greater part of her life fighting for women's suffrage. So you finally see this moment that might convince people this should not be happening. Why these women are willing to do this to get the right to vote. They knew it could lead to change, and it did.
Yeah. And how long, I think you said it, but how long were the women incarcerated for?
The max sentence was 6 months. I think the standard was maybe closer to 2 months.
Okay. All right. Thank
Jenna,
you so much.
If I can jump in, I saw a good question. Somebody asked how long this exhibit is going to be here. So it might be way dark. Hey, now I'm more late. We're considering this a long-term exhibit. We don't have an end date for it currently. So it will be here for the next several years. So, you can see it anytime in 2023, 2024. It'll probably be here a little bit longer than that, but definitely if you come this year or next year, you'll be able to see this exhibit.
Yeah, wouldn't want to miss that one. Thanks you, Sarah.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to make sure you got anybody who can come to Philadelphia, please come check it out. And we would love to have you.
All right. I think that's all of the questions and we are at time too. It's almost 2 o'clock. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you. Huge thank you to Sarah and Elena for coming and for this special look at our women's suffrage exhibit, especially the kind of all the behind the scenes insights about why and how we put this exhibit together. It was really special. So thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Like I said, this recording will probably be on YouTube in the next couple of days, but you can always email us and ask any other questions. So thanks so much. Have a great day.